Good evening, everyone. We'll get started with this session. My name is Chandni, and I'll be chairing this session. We'll have two invited talks. The first speaker is Priya Mahadevan. She's from SNBNCBS Center, and she'll be talking about the unusual behavior of twisted bilayers in TMDCs. Over to you, Priya.
Thanks, Chandni. We haven't heard too much about the transition metal dichalcogenides, and I'm going to tell you something about the twisted bilayers of these materials, focusing on homo bilayers of basically MO and tungsten-based transition metal dichalcogenides. But before I come to the twisted, one has known these the MO and W-based transition metal dichalcogenides for a very long time. But what seems surprising is that we really don't understand why they are semiconducting. Okay, so if you look at this, I'm taking the most stable polymorph, which is known as the 1H. The 2H structure. If you have just one monolayer, it goes by the nomenclature of 1H. And so if you look at a top-down view, this is what it looks like. These are the transition metal atoms are in purple, and your anions are these green atoms over here. But if you look at the side, take a side view of the structure, what you have is you have a central plane of the molybdenum atoms and a top layer of the anions and a bottom layer of the anions. So if you look at the environment of each of these transition metal atoms, what you can see is that they have 6 anion neighbors, which form a trigonal prismatic crystal field, which lifts the degeneracy, the 5-fold degeneracy of the d orbitals. And so what you have is the dz squared, which is lowest in energy, and then the dxy and the dx squared minus y squared, and then the dyz and the dxc. So molybdenum here has, if you looked at, has a formal d electron count of 2. So going about filling up these levels, what you'd have is that you have 2 electrons over here in these levels, and these are unoccupied. And this is the basic understanding of why these materials are semiconducting. However, if you look at the electronic structure, and what I show you is the band dispersions plotted along various symmetry lines. And so 0 here is the top of my valence band. And we've done something extra over here. In addition to the bands, we've also color-coded them, color-coded the weight of the dx squared minus y squared and the dz squared contribution to these bands. And what you can see is, if it was this picture that I showed you earlier, which is that just the dz squared is occupied, you'd have seen only one color, which is red right through, and you'd have seen only the blue color above here. But what you can see is, indeed, we have a deviation from this simple picture, and you have a mix, dz. If you look at these, let me focus on the 2 important symmetry points, which are important in the context of the transition metal dichalcogenides. At gamma, what you have is the highest occupied band has dz squared character, whereas at k, you have a combination of the dx squared minus y squared and dxy, which hasn't been shown over here, contributing. So how do we understand this? What you would think first is, okay, there are interactions between these d orbitals, which we need to consider. But let me look at, taking a look at the structure, what you have is that the d orbital, the transition metal atoms are separated by 3.16 angstroms in this compound MOS2, whereas the molybdenum sulfur distance is about 2.41 angstroms. So, okay, so it's not very unusual to have some interaction between these. So the simplest picture I would think of would be that I introduce in a tight binding framework, I have not only hopping between the molybdenum and the sulfur sites, I also have hopping between these molybdenum sites. Okay, so we're setting up a tight binding model, and what we did was we set up a model with the molybdenum D and the sulfur P states in the basis. And what we did was, within this model, we switched off the interactions between these any hopping between the molybdenum sites. And what you find is that the system becomes metallic. So this means that I just need to have a model which has also a molybdenum hopping so that I can describe this system. Well, it doesn't seem to be so simple, because when we looked at this contribution from from this, considering the first nearest neighbor molybdenum neighbors of the central molybdenum atom, what you can see is that I can take the in-plane orbitals and I can write down the matrix elements between these in-plane. That is between the dxy and the dx squared minus y squared. It takes on this form with these phase factors. And so at gamma, what you have is that this matrix element between the dxy and the dx squared minus y squared vanishes, as well as at k, because of these values of these matrix elements vanishes. So what does that have? What does that imply? Going back to this figure, what you'd have is you have, okay, over here it's fine. It's the same as the crystal field picture that I presented. But over here you have both the dx squared, you would have the dx squared minus y squared and the dxy degenerate over here, which wouldn't explain why the system is insulating, because those states can hold only 2 electrons. Okay, and so this picture. So within this picture, we really don't, within a D-only model, we could probably explain some part of the band structure, the gap opening up at some non-high symmetry points, considering an interaction between these dx squared minus y, the in-plane orbitals and the out-of-plane orbitals. However, coming to this symmetry point, we wouldn't be able to explain why the system would be insulating. So essentially what you have is actually you need to take, it's actually the coupling between the in-plane p orbitals, which comes into play. And as a result of this, what happens is that the dx squared minus y, it's a linear combination of this, which is the bonding state, and a linear combination, which is an anti-bonding state. So at k, you have a linear combination occupied, that's how the gap emerges over here. So it's a combination of both these interactions, which plays an important role in understanding even the untwisted limits semiconducting state. Okay, so now we move on to the twisted limit. And what's interesting about it? Well, there were some experiments. This is from Corey Dean and Abhay Pashupati's group, taking the example of twisted bilayers of tungsten diselenide for a twist angle of 5.1 degrees. And what they did was, this represents the hole doping concentration into the valence band. And what you can see is what's been plotted is, what's been color-coded over here is the resistivity. And so what you have is you have these zero resistance states, and then you have an increase in the resistivity, possibly an insulating state, and then again these zero resistive states. So essentially, this is not what you'd expect for a simple semiconductor, where you have a valence band and a conduction band. So at the undoped limit, you'd have the Fermi level over here in the gap. And then as you dope into the system, the Fermi level moves into the valence band. And so you have metallic transport. So why do we have these changes in the resistivity? This is not only for the twist angle that I showed you over there, but it's for various twist angles, right, ranging from 4 degrees all the way to 5.1 degrees. I mean, these were the experimental limitations that they could probe this range, but theoretically we could go we could go to smaller angles also. And I'll show you what we think is happening. And this is Bernal stacked graph WSE2, which behaves as expected. You have, in the absence of doping, you have this high resistance peak. And then as you're doping into the system, you have metallic transport. So this is basically the picture based on which the phase diagram, this figure was constructed. So essentially at each of these twist angles, you see you have these high resistance peaks, then suddenly you have this metallic transport, then there's an increase in the resistivity, and which they associate with half filling of the band. I'll come back to this point later. Okay, so I mean, these are van der Waals materials, and that's why this whole field has become popular, because you can easily peel off layers. So the question is, why would the physics suddenly change when you construct heterostructures? Because, I mean, after all, the interaction between the layers should be very weak. So essentially, one of the ideas that has been suggested is that, well, when you have these small twist angles, you have these large unit cells, and they have very small Brillouin zones associated with them. So should we think of these systems as, giant, molecules with dispersionless levels, and we are doping into it and seeing all the strong correlation physics in these materials. So the approach we adopted was we know that the untwisted bilayers can be easily separated out, implying a weak interaction between the layers. And this indeed should reflect in the electronic structure. And so what we did was, again, plotted the electronic structure along various symmetry directions for the monolayer, which is shown over here in the red dashed line, and for the bilayer, which is shown over here in the black line. And you can see that in most part, it's very similar. There are regions where it's different. And if you remember my the color-coded band dispersions, which I'd shown you earlier, there are deviations over here. But you remember this part is contributed by the dz squared orbitals. These are the out-of-plane orbitals. So there's a coupling between the atoms on different sides. And so what happens is in this case, because of the coupling, so this is the monolayer, this is the band from the monolayer, but because of the coupling, you have a splitting, bonding and an anti-bonding splitting here. Whereas the K point, again, if I remind you, was contributed by in-plane orbitals. So there's a very, very small splitting because the coupling between the two layers is really very small. So even in these van der Waals materials, all the changes are largely because there is a hopping interaction between these layers. It's small, but then it's there. Okay, and that's what leads to the changes in the electronic structure as you go from one layer to more layers. Okay, so essentially, just to prove the point, what we did was we mapped the ab initio band structure, which is shown in the black line over here, overlaid with the tight binding model, which was fitted to this for both the monolayer and the bilayer. We have a good description. So now we took the bilayer Hamiltonian, tight binding Hamiltonian, switched off all interlayer interactions, and then superposed it on the monolayer, superposed the eigenvalues we got for the bilayer with interlayer interaction switched off on the monolayer, and you see that they superpose very well. So all the electronic structure changes are because of these hopping interactions between the two layers. Okay, so far. So then the question we asked is, how should we view the Moiré cells and how should we view their electronic structure? So should we just view them as the untwisted limit plus a weak perturbation? So in order to do that, let me show you something where, okay, so let me just show you a result just to emphasize what exactly I mean. So I can just take a simple unit cell, I repeat it without any perturbation. Okay, so what I've done is taken a material. This is its band structure along this is the primitive cell. For the primitive cell, or the smallest unit cell, this is the band structure. I repeat it 16 times in a particular direction, and this is the band structure. So this is significantly different. You have a very small unit cell. You have a very large unit cell and a very small Brillouin zone. And so therefore, what you're seeing is this gamma XC, which are the supercell Moiré, which has supercell symmetry directions, is just as 1/16 the length of this gamma to X direction. So, and of course, because your unit cell is much larger, bands fold, and so you see a lot of flat bands. Indeed, we have no perturbation here, and it's just repeated cells, and our physics shouldn't change by the size of the unit cell we consider. So what we do is we actually take the eigenfunctions in this case and project it onto the primitive cell eigenfunctions. So that's the approach we did. So for a perfect, so you take instead of adding the perturbation and solving the problem, we can solve the problem in every case, even with the perturbation. So we take the eigenfunctions for the perturbed case and project it onto the unperturbed and try to examine what exactly is happening. In this case, there are no perturbations, and we recover entirely the unperturbed or the primitive cell band structure. Okay. So now let's just as it's believed that it's the large unit cell which is responsible for these flat bands, we took a large unit cell at a large at a large twist angle. And later I'll show you a similar sized unit cell for a small twist angle. Okay, so here my unit cell dimensions are about 52 angstroms. And what we did was we calculated suppose I were to plot the band structure along the Moire cell directions, I would see a lot of flat bands. However, as I showed earlier, this probably doesn't make much sense. And we don't really, you see a lot of, you don't get much out of it. However, by the approach that by projecting the wave functions, the eigenfunctions of this Moire cell onto the primitive cell, what we did, we plotted that as a function along these symmetry directions, along the gamma to k, and it's color coded here representing the weight of the eigenfunction on the primitive cell. And you see that you have dispersive bands even for this very large unit cell. Just to what we've done again is to superpose the untwisted limit, which is shown over here in the green line. And what you can see is that pretty much the low energy electronic structure is pretty much similar to the untwisted limit. So for these large twist angles, the large unit cell hypothesis doesn't seem to work. And we are recovering the untwisted limit band structure. How about going to an angle in the regime which was probed in the experiment? So we do that over here. And what we see is for a small twist angle of 3.48, we have a similar sized Moire unit cell. And what we find is, and we decided we'd examine this. Now, in contrast to the previous figure, if you just looked over here, there seem to be some, if you can identify certain patches which are associated with particular types of stacking. Just to explain that with the smaller cell, what you have is you could have when you have two layers sitting on top of each other, you could have a case where they would sit right on top of each other. This is the side view that I'm showing you, and this is the top view. Whereas you could also have a staggered type of arrangement of the atoms, staggered type of arrangement of the two layers. So in this case, what you have is that since the atoms are not sitting on top of each other, what you'd have is that in this case, the steric repulsions of the electrons on this layer and the electrons over here is less. And as a result, what's going to happen is that the two layers can come closer to each other. Whereas in this case, when you have the atoms, the anions sitting directly above the anions of the lower layer, the interlayer separation is much larger. So what we did was we went back, and if I go back and look at this, what you can see is we started with a particular atom-on-atom stacking. So that's reflected over here. And if I looked at the interlayer separation in this region, it comes out to be about 3.74 angstroms from our calculations. Whereas in this region, where you see a staggered type of stacking, okay, the interlayer separation comes out to be about 3.2 angstroms. Okay, so far so good. So then we went on to do the same analysis that we had done earlier and project the eigenfunctions of the Moire cell onto the primitive cell. And the color coding and is the same. So the green line over here represents the untwisted limit. So we do have, even for this small twist angle, we do have dispersive bands. But just above these dispersive bands, what we have is a flat band separating out, which has zooming in on this, we have a dispersional width associated with it of about 19 MeV. Additionally, what we also see is that if the first thing we asked is this because of the modulation in the interlayer separation that we are seeing this kind of behavior? And so what we did next was just to keep them at a fixed interlayer separation and see what happens in such a case. So doing that, we again, this is shown slightly differently. What the width is actually proportional to the weight at that. Instead of the color coding, we've used the width as quantifying how much is the projection. And what you can see is even here we have a flat band which is separating out from a set of dispersive bands. So essentially, the flat bands seem to be forming over here. And it's not the modulation. I mean, the question is, even in the, it's not the modulation which is responsible for the flat bands happening. They happen even without these relaxations. I'll come back to the point whether relaxations are required or not later on. But so then what is responsible? What is the reason why these flat bands are forming? So as I said earlier, the interaction between the layers is because of the hopping between the two layers, even in these materials. So the hopping depends on the distance between the atoms. Okay, so so the selenium distances should be a good parameter to quantify, changes in the hopping interactions. So looking at 19.03, this is a histogram profile of all the selenium distances that we have up to about 4.4 angstroms. And what you can see is that both this case as well as the case where you have the small twist angle at a fixed interlayer separation seem to have a similar profile of the interlayer selenium distances, which really means that it's not the profile of your selenium distances which is leading to a flat band formation. You have a flat band in this case as well as a flat band in this case where we've optimized the interlayer separation, and the profiles are pretty different. So what exactly is going on? So we then went on to look at the real space profile of these interlayer distances. And what you can see is this: at 19.03, we have a rather random distribution of these distances. Whereas at 3.48, what you can see is that there's a concentration of the number of neighbors as well as the interlayer distance, shortest interlayer distances, which is a bit less than 3.8 angstroms in this region, which seems to suggest that you have regions of enhanced perturbation, which is responsible for this flat band separating out over here. And as you saw, the flat band was separating out at gamma, and so it's the interlayer hopping interactions which is responsible for the flat band emerging out. Looking at, so indeed, when you looked at the charge density associated with the flat band, it's localized in this region where you have the strongest where you have these interlayer distances less than this, indeed suggesting that it's the interlayer hopping interactions which are responsible for this band separating out. Now, okay, so just okay, I see I don't have that result, but in the case of when I didn't have the interlayer distances optimized and I had a fixed interlayer distance, I do have the flat band formation, but the localization of the flat band is very different in this case. So in that case, which means that although you get the flat band physics even in the unrelaxed case, because you have these patches which have a particular type of stacking, however, you need the relaxations to get the details of the localized wave function correctly. Okay. So now all this was about gamma point, where you do, as I said, you have a significant coupling between the two layers. What happens at the K point, you know that they are contributed by the in-plane orbitals. And well, spin orbit plays the role of, well, separating out, of merely introducing splitting between these levels. And so the question is, would I have since there's no coupling in this case, would I even see a flat band formation in this case? Okay, so now the twisted bilayer tungsten diselenide, the experiments which I presented at the beginning, correspond to this regime where the valence band maximum is localized at the K point. Okay, so now we took the particular type of stacking which they use in the experiment, which is the 2H, which is a staggered type of stacking. And so what you see over here, we do, when we relax it, the details are the same, that when it's that you have different regions which could have different interlayer separations. Again, carrying out the same kind of mapping projection of the eigenfunctions of this Moire cell onto the primitive cell, and using the same notation where this represents the color coding represents the weight, and the green lines over here represent the untwisted limit. What we see over here is that we have flat bands emerging over here at gamma point, but the highest occupied band, as I revealed earlier, is at the K point. Zooming in over here, what you have is that you seem to see two bands over here, which are two bands which are crossing each other, which are almost flat, in this case too. So what exactly seems to be happening? There's one point which I did not, which I did not mention when I showed you this figure, which is that this peak was prominent only when they used an electric field, a top gate. So essentially, what is the role of this, and why should that make this peak so prominent? So let's go back to those two bands which I showed you, and let me try to reconstruct the band by looking at the character of each of these bands. So looking at the character of the eigenfunction, you can just look at these points labeled A, B, and D, and they all seem to have the same character. They are all localized on the lower layer, and this represents the percentage on the lower layer, and this is the side view. And what you can see is that all of them, it's almost 100% localized on this lower layer. Whereas in this case, in the case of C, as well as these points over here, these are all localized on the upper layer. So what you can immediately see that think of this as a case where you have the two layers and there's hardly any coupling between the layers, and the role of the electric field is to just introduce a staggered potential, or an on-site energy difference between the two layers. So what happens is, in the presence of the electric field, I can separate out these two bands, and that's what we're able to achieve. And now going back to the experiments, what you can see is that, well, if you had your Fermi energy here, you would have it to be semiconducting. Move it into this, it's metallic, and then again semiconducting and metallic. So you could have, even in this effective single particle picture, we could have these transitions seen in the system. Okay, so now what's the origin of this flat band? Why am I seeing it? So I showed you, if you remember, I showed you another large-sized unit cell. I mean, at 19.03, we had a unit cell which was pretty much similar sized, which had a similar size. And so we went back and looked at that and to see whether in this case, in the case of tungsten diselenide, we're going to see flat bands. And everything is the same. What you have is the untwisted limit band structure, and over here, the band structure pretty much is similar to the untwisted limit. So there's nothing interesting at this large twist angle in this case. Okay, so then why are we seeing these flat bands forming in this case? So what is the origin of the perturbation? So, well, because they have similar, the only other thing, because the coupling between the layers is very small, they're contributed by in-plane orbitals. So the question is, shouldn't the Moire potentials be similar? And that was where we were very surprised. We took the Moire potentials in these two cases, did the Fourier transforms, and what we found was that the Fourier components of the Moire potential are dominantly associated with the reciprocal lattice vectors of the primitive cell. Okay, so which means that, think of it this way, that you have your untwisted, I'm going to show it to you in a minute, you have your untwisted limit Brillouin zone, and your scattering happens at the Brillouin zone of your untwisted limit. Okay, it's not the small Moire cell Brillouin zones that your scattering is happening. Okay, so looking at it, let's take the example of 19.03 and think of it this way, that these are some of the states in the way of the wave functions, and what is shown over here in the black line is the Brillouin zone of the lower layer, and in the red line is of the rotated layer, Brillouin zone, all of the primitive cell. Okay, so these points are far away from the Brillouin zone boundaries, and since the scattering happens at these points, so their band structure is not perturbed in this case at all. Okay, so essentially now going to the and that's why what we see is that the band structure is pretty much similar to the untwisted limit. However, go to 3.48, and what you can see, it's the same notation. So what you see is that these are, all the points are close to the Brillouin zone boundaries, and so they experience a very strong scattering in this case. And as a result, what you're going to see is that we see the flat band formation happening in this case. Okay. Now, going back to this picture that of which associated this peak with the half filling of the band. In our calculation, what we see is that since you have this strong Brillouin zone scattering, one of the bands gets scattered away, and there's just one band left at k and at minus k. So essentially, what you have is that it's just one band which is over here. So it's not the half filling of the band that we're seeing, and so essentially this entire picture can be captured within a effective single particle picture. Okay. So now the next question which we asked is, how do we change the number of bands and the number of flat bands that one has? And so what we did was we took two examples where the twist angle was the same. I went from 0 degrees, and we twisted by 3.48, and we took the structure from 60 degrees and rotated it by 3.48. So essentially we'd have different sets of stackings in both the cases. So what you would have in this case, we have the rest of the details come out to be the same, that when you have this AA type regions of AA stacking, you have the interlayer separation to be about 3.8 angstroms. Where you have the staggered type of stacking, you have the interlayer separation coming out to be about 3.2 angstroms. In this case, again, we have, we started out with an AB type of stacking. That was our untwisted limit. And because I'm starting with 60 degrees rotated case. And so from that, and what you would see over here is that the interlayer separation comes out to be about 3.25 angstroms over here, whereas in this case, these patches emerge after the rotation, which have a AA prime stacking or a 2H stacking, which has a 3.2 angstrom interlayer separation. Okay, so now look again, we see that, this was a result which I showed you earlier also. We have a single, we have a single band coming out, single flat band coming out. However, when we looked at the results at the twist angle of about 56.52, what we see is that there are two flat bands emerging in this case. Okay, so how, so fine. So what we see is that if we looked at the profile of the short selenium-selenium distances, in this case, we find this to be the real space profile. And looking at the localization of the charge density in this case, which seems to be a better picture, what you see is that the charge density is localized over a larger region for the 3.48, whereas in this case, at the 60 minus 3.48, it's localized over a smaller region. So you have a set of these quantum wells which have a larger separation in this case, and as a result of this, you have the possibility of more flat bands emerging in this case compared to this case. So when we looked at I showed you that there were two flat bands emerging in this case. So the wave function that I showed you just now corresponded to this flat band over here. However, looking at the next one, it seems this is the charge density associated with it, corresponding to like a quantum, the higher excited states of these quantum wells. Okay, so with that, I think I've finished a little faster than I planned. So I'd like to put up the conclusions, which is that the concentrated regions of enhanced interlayer interactions lead to these subband formation for the twisted bilayers of molybdenum diselenide. And in tungsten diselenide, we're able to explain the effects of the manipulation of the electronic structure with an electric field, as well as the origin of the flat band, which has a very different origin over here compared to the case of the molybdenum diselenide. And of course, all this work was done by my PhD students, and I'm just presenting them It was mainly the work of the thesis of Sumanti Patra, and the initial part was, which I presented about understanding the semiconducting nature of the untwisted limit, was is a part of Prashun's thesis. And these are some of the published references, and funding is acknowledged from these agencies. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Priya. Time for questions.
Hello. Yeah, Priya, very nice talk. So it's really interesting that you can turn on and off the interactions and then look at where the physics is coming from. So in some of the real space charge density plots,
yeah,
you were showing that it was almost reminiscent of like these domains that we.
Yes, I mean, I guess that these are, I mean, the Moiré cells we consider are small. So therefore, you have these domains between the different, different regions. Whereas if I go to certain other twist angles, these are your domains. But I mean, yeah, I wouldn't be able to access them within this framework.
Right. So then, do you have any comments on the optical properties of these things?
So we haven't, we haven't looked at the optical properties of these specifically. The main thing is that it's an indirect gap. The conduction band minima is not at the same point, but the conduction band minima is at a different point. So that's one aspect. And the other thing is that they have very interesting, especially when you have the electric field tunability. So what you'd have, you can play around with the the nature of the states. And so with that, you can actually have, so you can play around with what are the lowest states between which you're talking about the transitions. I can show you some of the things, but I haven't put it in my talk. Yes.
Any other questions?
I couldn't quite tell if the spin-orbit coupling was included.
The spin-orbit coupling has been included, and yeah.
Thank you.
Ma'am, in the charge density plots which you have shown in the last,
yeah,
so that plots are obtained using DFT calculations?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So for that calculation, you took this whole supercell,
yeah, it's for these whatever these Moiré cells that we considered. And for the charge density, what I'm showing you is essentially, for instance, just a second. So in this case, we've taken these bands, as I said, it's better here. So what's shown over here is I take this particular band at the K point, and look at the charge density associated with this. So I plotted it for each of these, at each of these points.
And ma'am, in this where the electric field is applied,
yeah,
there is a gap opening at some points.
Yes.
So what is the reason, like the physical reason behind
Okay,
this?
so you can just think of it that you have two layers. The coupling between the two layers is zero. So with the electric field, I'm changing the on-site energies difference between the two layers. It's just, I mean, you can convert that into a potential, the effective potential, E dot D. Okay, and you can, so because of the separation between the two layers, I have an on-site energy difference, which is for the top layer with respect to the lower layer.
Okay, ma'am, thank you.
Any more questions?
Thanks for a great talk. I have a question about this slide. So I like this alternative explanation of the metal to insulator transition. But what triggered us back then to attribute this to correlations was also the behavior with temperature. So there's this sharp drop. So this resistive state goes away quite sharply with temperature.
Okay.
So is this consistent with this?
I mean, this is a zero temperature calculation, so we wouldn't be able to do a temperature dependence.
But yeah, but one could just say, compare this to thermal energies and see whether it about
because you are talking about, you know, very small gaps over here. And I mean, in the sense, so you, as a function of temperature, you could have excitations.
Right. So I'm just asking, you know, what is this compared, what is this small gap in Kelvin?
In Kelvin?
Right.
Okay.
Is this about making sense with?
Right. Okay, there are 2 points which I'd like to, the reason I didn't convert is also because I have the bands at few points. I mean, I should have more points, more density and thing, but it's 5 MeV, 10 MeV, things like that. Yes.
All right, thanks.
Yeah, Priya, a small follow-up question.
Yeah.
So when you say that, you know, you can derive the physics of these Moire bands using like small perturbations.
Yeah.
But at small twist angles, we have seen people have seen reconstruction happening, right? These interactions are not that weak, right? So you can actually change the sort of have domain formation, and so does the picture sort of break down at very low twist angles?
So I mean, my main point, okay, I should have clarified earlier, is that it gives us the starting point. For instance, especially, I mean, maybe certain aspects of the physics can be captured at K where you have a single band. But I mean, it gives us the starting point for setting up a Hamiltonian and maybe including extra terms. For instance, I mean, I'm considering a very rigid band picture as I'm changing, changing the carrier concentration across, but there could be, you know, things which, there could be redistribution of the carriers, which could also happen. So I'm just giving you a view that, okay, some aspects of the physics seem to be captured. I mean, doping related issues where you could have charge density waves or spin density waves and other things. I mean, I think using this as a starting point to go beyond. That's my personal view.
Yeah, if not, let's thank Priya one more time. Thank you.